Test. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Welcome. Dis&Dat information. 10 July 2025. Classical political economy 9. Now, this may or may not have, we may not look at a video today. We may look at a video tomorrow, however, and we're going to look at a several years later version of the Anwar Shaikh lecture after the book is published, his 4C's book, Capitalism, Conflict, etc. And so it's more constructed like a course set of lectures. And so on the one hand, well, it might repeat itself. On the other hand, it is more coherent in that particular context. And so we might actually look more directly at the text itself while we do that. But that's for tomorrow. What we're going to look at today is finally get to the text on the page itself. First with the Milios value theory revisited. And if we have time, to look at the post article, which discusses the more contemporary version of some of the comparative theory issues. So, Marx's value theory revisited, a value form approach, John Milios. Marx's Capital does not present an analysis of different economic models of themes, that is, first the simple commodity production, then the capitalist commodity, etc. It has a unique object of study. This is unlike, of course, what Shaikh was doing. The capitalist mode of production, i.e. the immanent regularities and tendencies of capitalist social relations, which Marx analyzes, first of all, in relation with the concept of value, and just started with that with the Shaikh text. From the first text in the period under examination, the Grundrisse, yes, as mentioned also by Shaikh, 1857 to 8, to Capital, 1867, Marx insisted that value is an expression of relations exclusively characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, CMP. Marx specifies and develops the notion of value, and through it all, other notions reflecting the CMP, capitalist mode of production, on the basis of a twofold methodology. A, an analysis on different levels of abstraction. I think you could see that Shaikh was getting there, which aims at B, a process of gradual clarification - concretization, starting from a commonly accepted definition of the concept under discussion and reconstructing it step by step into a new Marxian concept. It is in this sense that his theory constitutes a critique and not a correction or a version of classical political economy. It's then clear that a comprehensive theoretical investigation of Marx's theory shall not stick itself to the introductive treatment of the notions in question, but take into consideration his whole analysis, that is, into 3 volumes of Capital, with, of course, the proviso that, of course, it's all we get is volume 1, but they are the remaining 2 somewhat incomplete. So, number 2, the introduction of Marx's monetary theory of value, which is what we saw in the last lecture, the circulation of commodities. Marx applies the above described methodology to the elaboration of his concept of value. That is why he makes a Ricardian-like version of value as his point of departure. Now, however, he did not restrict himself to this initial definition, according to which value is identified with the quantity of labor, with socially average characteristics of productivity and intensity expended on the production of a commodity, but formulated a new monetary theory of value. Noting, of course, as Sheikh says, that it never is fully complete, but it is quite different and specified differently, as has been argued elsewhere. For example, Heinrich, Melios, Chris Arthur. Marx's theory of value shapes a new theoretical domain and a new theoretical object of analysis. Marx's concept of value constitutes a complex notion, a theoretical junction or conjuncture, which allows the deciphering of the capital relation by combining the specifically capitalist features of the labor process with the corresponding forms of appearance of the products of labor. You could see Sheikh was getting at that, right? About the question of how is labor represented in terms of direct and indirect ways, etc. Marx shaped thus a new theoretical discourse and a new theoretical paradigm of argumentation. He showed that the products of labor become values because they are produced within the framework of the capital relation, i.e., as products of capital, see Arthur 2002. Further, that value is necessarily manifests itself in the form of money. Accordingly, money is the par excellence manifestation of value and thus of capital. Value is the property that the products of labor acquire in capitalism, a property which gains material substance that is actualized in the market through the exchangeability of any product of labor with any other, that is, through their character as commodities bearing a specific monetary price on the market. Value, hence, registers the relationship of exchange between each commodity and all other commodities, so it's among commodities, and expresses the effect of the specifically capitalist homogenization of the labor processes in the CMP. That is, production for the exchange and for profit, as delineated through the concept of abstract labor. Value is therefore determined by abstract labor. However, abstract labor does not constitute an empirical magnitude, which could be measured by the stopwatch, for example. It is an abstraction, although it is still obviously has some empirical relation in terms of time. And Sheikh has described this in a variety of ways, and of course, as socially necessary in that particular way. But it is an abstraction which is constituted, that is, it acquires a tangible existence in the process of exchange. Social labor time exists in these commodities in a latent state, so to speak, and becomes evident only in the course of their exchange. So it's praxeological in that sense. Universal social labor is consequently not a ready-made prerequisite, but an emerging result. And this is that immanence thing I've been yammering about that we will get back to. Marx commences with developing his theory of value and of the capitalist mode of production from an analysis of commodity circulation in order to decipher, as Sheikh was describing this, the difference between Department 1 and Department 2. That is, production and circulation. In order to decipher the form of appearance of value as money, he introduces the scheme of the simple form of value, in which seemingly a quantity of a commodity is exchanged for a different quantity of another commodity. And you can see, hopefully, he was describing the way in which you can talk about this. X commodity A is exchanged for, or equals to, in terms of a transitive sort of exchange, for Y commodity B. Classical economists have thought this scheme to be barter, They further consider that all market transactions may be reduced to such simple barter acts merely facilitated by money, since with money's mediation, a mutual coincidence of needs is not required anymore. Marx shows, however, that in this scheme, this barter scheme, we do not have two commodities of pre-existing equal values, for example, measured independently by the quantity of labor expended for their production exchanging with each other. Instead, there's only one commodity as an abstraction, right? The commodity acquiring the first, that i.e. the left-hand position or the relative value form, whose value is measured in units of a different use value. That is the commodity acquiring the position of the equivalent. This is that motion, movement, circulation stuff that we're talking about, and thus serving as the measurer of value of the commodity in the relative form. Now, the second commodity in the position of the equivalent B is not an ordinary commodity, that is, as a unity of exchange value and use value, but plays simply the role of a measure of value of, for example, money for the first commodity. So you have this thing, and money is a kind of equivalent. Now, it's not a direct equivalent. It's ephemeral in that sense. It's not epiphenomenal. It is, it's conceptual in that way. And in fact, that's kind of how we deal with reality, right? You go to the store and you buy something, et cetera, and you pay money or, whatever. The value of the relative A is being expressed exclusively in units of the equivalent B. That is, the value of the latter, that is, of B, cannot be expressed. It does not exist in the world of tangible reality. So it's intangible in that same sense. But as soon as the coat takes up the position of the equivalent in the value expression, the magnitude of its value ceases to be expressed quantitatively. On the contrary, the coat now figures in the value equations merely as a definite quantity of some article. It has come out, therefore, that the simple value form does not amount to an equality in the mathematical sense, or at least this mathematical sense, or a conventional equivalence, that is, X commodity A equals Y commodity B, which would imply that Y commodity B equals X commodity A. It is, on the contrary, characterized by a polarization, i.e. by the fact that each pole between two poles, right, dipole, occupies a qualitatively different position and has a correspondingly different function. So this is being worked out in time, as it were, from one moment to the next. This polarization and this difference result in the fact that value is manifested, i.e. it empirically appears only in exchange value. In other words, the simple form of value tells us that X units of commodity A have the value of Y units of the equivalent B, or that the value of a unit of commodity A is Y over X units of B. So in other words, this is a kind of a motion or a movement from one moment to another. In its Marxian version, the simple form of value measures only the value of commodity A in units of the equivalent B. From the analysis of the simple value form, Marx has no difficulty in deciphering the money form. For this purpose, he utilizes two intermediate intellectual formulas, the total or expanded, that is, and the general form for expressing value. So you have one value for expanded and the general form for expressing value. The second form in this developmental sequence, this is this idea that it is sequence, it's moving in one direction. So you have the first form, the total or expanded general form for expressing value, and the second form in this developmental sequence, that is the general form for of value, is characterized by one and only one equivalent in which all the other commodities express their value. These commodities are thus always in the position of the relative value form. These commodities are thus always in the position of the relative value form. There is no absolute in that context. Only one thing that is commodity has come to constitute the universal equivalent form of values. This is why Marx begins Volume 1 with the idea of the commodity. The first feature of money is its property of being the general equivalent. That seems, we're used to that. Thus, the relation of general exchangeability of commodities is expressed or realized only in an indirect mediated sense, that is, through money, which functions as a general equivalent in the process of exchange, and through which all commodities acquiring the relative position express their value. A Marxian analysis does not, therefore, entail reproduction of the barter model, that is, the original sense of that, of just simply exchanging one commodity for another, since it holds that exchange is necessarily mediated by money. So there's a necessary connection. Money is interpreted as an intrinsic and necessary element in capitalist economic relations. There's some sort of thing that occurs that you get this kind of, social agreement in some ways about what money is, or at least in the moment of exchange. Commodities do not then assume the form of direct mutual exchangeability. Their socially validated form is a mediated one. So in other words, there's some abstraction there. It is about relations. It is about exchange, but as something more abstract and something that is clearly mediated. Now, this is obviously where all kinds of Marxian theories kind of go off, diverge, and become, interesting. But let's get back to this article. In Marx's theoretical system, there cannot be any other measure or form of appearance of value. The essential feature of the market economy of capitalism is thus not simply commodity exchanges maintained by mainstream theories, but monetary circulation in money. So therefore, the thing that Sheikh is talking about, is more fully developed and important, obviously in volume 1 of Capital. Money's really important. It just doesn't start the whole thing, even though kind of you sort of think, well, it is about money, isn't it? But he introduces the notion of commodity in order to get used to the idea of kind of the mechanism, how this thing sort of works or functions. The social character of labor appears as the money existence of the commodity, and hence as a thing outside actual production. So you have actual production, and then this thing of social character of labor appears as the money existence of the commodity. The fact that even the most straightforward act, that of exchanging two commodities, must be understood as a procedure consisting of two successive monetary transactions, that is, a sale followed by a purchase, something fairly obvious to us, but there's another way of thinking about it, right? That he has introduced certain ideas that appear in formula form, and as you could see, a slightly more algebraic form as Sheikh presents it. In accordance with the formula CMC, where C symbolizes the commodity and M the money, allows the comprehension of a main inherent trend of the market economy. That is, the propensity of money to become independent from its role as a means of exchange or a measure of value. That is, its tendency to become an end in itself. Now, on the one hand, in the case of hoarding, the Scrooge McDuck money bin, for example, as the result of a sale that is not followed by a purchase, hoarding, right, holding on to stuff. Retentiveness, C-M, and on the other, in the case that money functions as a means of payment, i.e. when the purchaser appears in the act M-C as debtor. So it's CMC, and we're looking at the front end, C to M, and then M to C as debtor, as the mere representative of money, or rather of future money. So this idea of a kind of anticipation is important, as Sheikh is talking about. Sheikh doesn't want to talk about expectations because that enters into a whole nother kind of discourse, but anticipation probably works, at least in the intermediate term. The circulation, this is Marx, the circulation of commodities differs from the direct exchange of products, that is barter, not only in form, but in substance. The process of circulation, therefore, does not, like direct barter of products, become extinguished upon the use values changing places and hands. No, circulation sweats money from every pore. Nothing can be more childish than the dogma that because every sale is a purchase and every purchase a sale, therefore the circulation of commodities necessarily implies an equilibrium of sales and purchases. Now, no one can sell unless someone else's purchases, but no one is forthwith bound to purchase because he has just sold. So there, this is not as direct as one might think. It is not, barter assumes that there's a kind of transaction, an immediate kind of, transaction. Mercantilism is kind of built that way. It's kind of how, Donald Trump thinks that way for a variety of non-trivial reasons. So money is the material embodiment of the social relations immanent, remember that word, immanent, in the capitalist mode of production. Production and circulation of commodities carries with it, or rather presupposes, money. With Marx's words, it has become apparent in the course of our presentation that value, which appeared as an abstraction, is only possible as such an abstraction as soon as money is posited. So you're working at this kind of level of abstraction, and it's not a problematic abstraction. It's one that you confront in reality. So it has a kind of material reality. It's just simply that you're not dealing necessarily with kind of the perfect forms of these commodities, the thing that you can get more fetishistic about, as in gold, for example. So we're just talking about money and not necessarily gold. This is why Sheikh avoids talking about that. Although talking about the representation, of course, of gold as paper is an entire history in and of itself. Number 3, Marx's monetary theory of capital. Taking into consideration the above stated analysis, one comprehends that in Marx's theory of money, the notion of the general equivalent cannot be the final, but an intermediate, provisional, and immature concept in the course of the theoretical analysis. So we're looking at, as I said, this kind of moment. The same is valid for the sphere of circulation of commodities, Department 2, which, according to Marx, builds the outer husk or the surface of the whole capitalist economy. The sphere of circulation is a structural feature of the capitalist mode of production. It characterizes no other mode of production. This is why it is a mode of production that has forces and et cetera, but it is a kind of historical thing. The fact that it hasn't yet quite ended, that it is highly uneven and all those other things is, of course, problematic to many people because certainly in history, many people hoped that, that it would dissolve itself, wither away. Didn't do that. Still hasn't. On the other hand, some people are really trying to kill it for perhaps not the best of reasons. We saw that even from the moment that Marx introduces the notion of money as the general equivalent, he argues that money does not only play the role of a means or a measure, but that it also tends to attain the role of an end in itself. People who, the money bin, right? Hoarding, means of payment, world money, stuff that people measure their characters by it, et cetera. Here we have to deal with the introductory definition of capital with the provisional and immature introduction of the concept of capital. That is, money functioning as an end in itself. And there's some people who, it's really important to them. And more problematic, of course, because it is a kind of abstraction. And, you can get, it's really quite psychiatric in that sense. In order to be able to function as an end in itself, money has to move in the sphere of circulation according to the formula M-C-M. Due to the homogeneity of money, however, this formula is meaningless unless for the case that it describes a quantitative change, i.e. an increase in value. The aim of this motion cannot be anything else than the continual creation of surplus money. The formula becomes then M-C-M prime. M-C-M prime, where M prime stands for M plus delta M. That is a change. However, money can function as such, an end in itself, only in the case that it dominates over the sphere of production and incorporates it into its circulation, that is M-C-M prime, i.e. when it functions as money capital. So in the big picture, we're talking about capital, but what we're looking at is just simply this motion between money and commodity, and it moves around like that, and production is there and circulation is there, but it doesn't doesn't become an end in itself until you sort of consider the whole business. The exploitation of labor power in the production sphere constitutes the actual presupposition for this incorporation and this motion. Thus, the circulation of money leads to capital, as Marx would say, is a big deal. Marx formulated and then developed the theory of capital on the basis of his concept of value. So this is why we get back to the question of value form. And you can, even though, well, one way of looking at it is this idea that it is a further, value is a further abstraction, and it has all of these other contingencies. Capital is value, which has been appropriated by capitalists. So therefore, power, control, property, other things are at work. Precisely because it constitutes value, capital makes its appearance as money and commodities. Measure some people as an end in itself, like to be measured in terms of, worth, net worth, right? How much is a person worth? The thing of being the number X ranked richest person is a kind of, a weird estimation of that. Other people would estimate themselves on the number of vehicles they own or whatever. That would be a commodity. But the commodities that function as capital are certain specific commodities. That is the means of production, constant capital on one hand, the kind of physicality of it, and labor power, variable capital on the other. That's little c and little v. The capitalist appears on the market as the owner of money, big M, buying commodities, bracket C, big C. I'm sorry, that looks like a copyright, but it is big C, which consist of means of production, MP, and labor power, LP. In the process of production P, the C, the commodities, are productively used up in order to create an outflow of commodities, a product C prime, whose value would exceed that of C. Some transformation is occurring. You take the raw materials and you make stuff. It comes together and it transforms. Finally, he sells that outflow in order to recover a sum of money, M prime. Of course, you want to get, you want to make it dear in that sense, DEAR, higher than M. In the Marxist theory, the capitalist mode of production, both value and money are concepts which cannot be defined independently of the notion of capital. So all of this is capital. It's why Marx writes it that way. You can see all the things moving around, and that's kind of what constitutes capital. Marx's theory, being a monetary theory of value, is at the same time a monetary theory of capital. So this is the determination that it is why, we have certain post-Keynesian movements like modern money theory, et cetera. Marx is sort of there. He just, as Sheikh described it, he didn't quite get to it. He describes it, he gives it enough shape, but, he was going to fix this in a further volume, but he doesn't get to it. The motion of money as capital binds the production process to the circulation process. That is, it connects Department 1 and Department 2, and the means that commodity production becomes a phase or a moment. Remember, we talked about moment 1 to moment 2. Although the decisive moment for the whole valorization process, now, it's the first time we've introduced this word, but the production of value, that is this greater abstraction of the total circuit of social capital, remember, all of these things are still socially necessary in one way or another, is M-C equals MP plus LP, and as production, it becomes C prime, then M prime. So that looks a lot more complicated. It isn't really that complicated. You saw all the variables up above, so it's really MCM, but C is constituted as both a means of production and the labor process. And then as production, it just gains something, it becomes valorized. And as a commodity, there's more of the commodity there and ultimately more money. So it's pretty much simple. It's MCM with, and it has these subcategories in it. Value, therefore, now becomes value in process, money in process, and as such, capital. The circulation of money as capital is, on the contrary, an end in itself. for the expansion of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The circulation of capital there has therefore no limits. This is why Marx is interested in calculus later on. The circuit of social capital attains its dynamics from the exploitation of labor power in the sphere of production. However, it is wider than the commodity production and circulation process, since it embraces also, as was implied by Marx, with the further volumes, also the spheres of credit and finance and the speculation associated with them. So that's kind of a front end of this, but in fact, that kind of compresses an incredible amount of volume one of capital, but that's kind of what is at the front end. Now, I talked a little bit of this review of Shake. You can read this for yourself, and it's an important one because it does describe Shake's general project, which is this idea of looking about macro dynamics, and but we won't get too wound up in that at the current moment. You can look at this at your own leisure. And of course, it is the critique that that from a critical realist point of view, that it is problematic in the sense that it one could say that it legitimates capitalism. But I think that's a very restricted view. You just have to simply analyze it. I think not unlike, taking over government in order to eliminate it, at least in a quasi-electoral way as it is at the current moment. Similarly, I think you only get a sense of it when you sort of really see how the watch works. So now there are causality questions, and what I just was talking about A or B, and then the question of endogenous or exogenous, that is things that occur within or without. That is something that's inside a model or outside a model. Endogenous and exogenous are, sort of big terms to really talk about a kind of logical set of relations. And this internal external thing is also a dialectical way of looking at things. And yeah, it's not as fully direct and fully, explicated, for example, as dialectical materialism, but in fact, it is the same logical question. For instance, is money endogenous or exogenous? Do savings determine investments or investments savings? And, Marx doesn't talk that much about savings, but it's there. It's just that he doesn't spend time talking about it. Now, for the sorts of mathematical methods that economists continually assume to be generally applicable, including Shake, the world must consist of deterministic or stochastic closed systems. So the contrast here, as with internal and external, is also with this idea about open or closed system. So a closed system is one in which an event regularly occurs. That is, whenever A, then B, under conditions X, Y, Z. But economic theorists do not agree whether A causes B or vice versa, or about how to define A and B. So there are a lot of little processes here that some people say, well, if you do too much of it, you'll turn into a neoclassicist or something. It's, this sort of weird idea that, cooties occur if you don't discuss these things. But the fact is, you do have to discuss them. It's very clear that the neoclassical model, may seem, from an econometric point of view, a closed system, but actually, when you try and do it empirically in reality, space and time begin to intervene, and it becomes to be much more problematic and, in fact, more interesting. But and that's why neoclassicism has engaged in a kind of self-limiting closed thing, because you always want to think, well, how is it actually working in reality? So there's always that pressure, an empirical pressure, to talk about things about like agency, freedom, history, or politics. So for the reviewer, Patamaki, it is thus not surprising that there's nothing in Shake's capitalism about real alternatives, about ecological sustainability, democracy, emancipation, learning, overcoming alienation, or socialism. Well, that's true. On the other hand, you have a better way of approaching the problem, at least some of the analytic elements are there, and it makes our process, our empirical process, actually a little easier. So Shake repeatedly downplays post-Keynesian alternatives, thus the methodological assumptions of Shake's book Capitalism, thus serve to undermine its ethico-political intentions. So, I would say that you shouldn't take that too seriously, because he makes implications that are, in every lecture he tries to, give you good examples of that. And I think he uses good examples or reasonable examples that help explicate the idea. And you have to sort of lighten up about those things. And you could see actually from the introductory lectures that students are asking questions derived from, coming up through somewhat neoclassical kinds of ways that some of the terms are perhaps not applied in the best ways. But I think he does a good job of kind of coping with them. Let's put it that way. So the conclusion of the Tharmaki review: what is capitalism? What's curious about Shake's capitalism? It does not refine or even characterize capitalism in any systematic fashion. It is well known that Marx did not use the term capitalism, although he theorized capital, talked about capitalists as a social class, and analyzed the capitalist mode of production. The term capitalism became increasingly common in the late 19th century as a critical term describing a society or social system characterized by the dominance of actual capitalists and their concepts. So Werner Sombart, 1902, modern capitalism established the meaning of the term. So Sombart, after Marx is dead, right, for several decades, you get a kind of solidification of the term. Joseph Schumpeter later insisted on distinguishing between entrepreneurs and capitalists in 1942. So you're moving fairly quickly on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of slow, because capitalism, socialism, democracy, in which Schumpeter anticipates capitalism's gradual decline, in fact, in agreement with Marx ultimately. But, we don't want to get too tied up in that, because some of our current debates still are Schumpeterian debates. Anyway, in passages where Shake discusses long-term economic developments from a global perspective, his data covers time from the 1600s onward. Just like my yammering about Italian banks. Mostly, Shake focuses on the era of modern economic growth that started in Britain in the 1820s after the Napoleonic Wars and following the Industrial Revolution, steam engine, blah, blah, blah. Quite methodically, however, Shake avoids mentioning social and political theorists that have made a lasting impact on our understanding of the nature and rise of capitalist market society. This is not in the remit of such a book. It'd be like 10 times longer, bigger, if he talked about it, but they're there. They are there. The implication is there. And so one of the most important and perceptive of these theorists has been Karl Polanyi. He's been mentioned before. I've mentioned it before. Others have mentioned Polanyi before. Brad DeLong does, for example. In The Great Transformation, originally published in 1944, Polanyi argued that the economic man and self-adjusting markets are neither natural nor universal. Rather, they are relatively recent socio-historical constructs. They are. Now, the fact is they become better structured, computerized, whatever, automated, stuff like that happens. And, you sort of have to cope with that, similar to the issues of studying capitalism, because it's there. A lot of people are heavily invested in it and will defend property on that basis, et cetera, and, kill people, blah, blah, blah. Moral and ethical things come from that as well. But, let's just get back to the text. The rise of, number one, the calculative gain orientation, i.e., acquisition, greed, whatever, appropriation. Number two, the modern market economy. And number three, the modern liberal state are essentially connected. All of these ideas are still connected. Democratic notions are still there. Libertarian notions are there. It's all still there. Now, so prior to the Great Transformation in modern Europe, markets existed as an auxiliary avenue for the exchange of goods that were otherwise not obtainable. In other words, you get market cultures created, and they come for a variety of seasonal reasons and because of better infrastructure, that is roads, trains, eventually trains, etc. The market society was born out of the changes that emerged first in Britain. Remember the 300-mile rule. Following the Great Transformation and related industrial revolution of the early 19th century and Polanyi's memorable formulation, the old world was swept away in one indomitable surge towards a planetary economy. And, Sheikh has no disagreement with this. Therefore, Polanyi placed the rules governing the world economy at the center of his analytical framework. This framework is also capable of illuminating the causes of our current turmoil and disorder. It is why people talk about world systems and a variety of other things, because many of our issues are, global issues, as with the climate crisis. In the late 2010s, it is again becoming increasingly evident that the utopian liberal vision of self-regulating markets leads not to peace, but to intensified conflict. And this involves a variety of other things that, of course, outside, this kind of discussion of capitalism, but yet still connected to capitalism. These people are in the way of your developing beachfront property. Now, what are you going to do with these people? Are you going to wipe them out, as in ethnic cleansing, or are you just going to sort of relocate them? And what rights do they have? What rights have they had? What is your rationale for doing that? What's, the moral or ethical support for this other position, which is equally problematic? From a Polanyian viewpoint, the world seems to be headed towards even more dangerous circumstances in the near future. So Patamaki, is sort of aware of what this suggests. The Sheikh is critical, as most of us, of neoliberal globalization. He argues against the Ricardian theory of free trade in terms of his theory of real competition, which implies that success comes with absolute cost advantage at the level of firms and may result in systematic and persistent imbalances in the world economy. Now, this is a big deal because, this is ultimately, this underlies the kind of dynamics that we're currently engaged in, that we're waging, I would assert, stupid activity on by people who don't, understand it that well. For example, tariff mania can be seen as taking advantage of imbalances in order to accumulate capital. Let's put it that way. And yet, in spite of his insightful observation, Sheikh seems committed, at least for the most part, to, and this is an important notion, to methodological nationalism. Now, this is sort of an over-labeling. Sheikh is just saying, and the way that he structures his own methodology for his research, the data comes as national data. It's called, international data is, divided up among nations, and it's pretty clear that it's not equal. There's all kinds of asymmetries in the analysis. And so to accuse him of methodological and nationalism, it's just simply is what's there. The borders are there. They're there because of stupid conflicts. They're there because some people have decided that other people's languages are not important and that they should have, a different set of languages, one that seems historically important, but doesn't necessarily represent the actual history of people who actually live in a location. And yet, people who can speak English don't necessarily speak English, and yet some people assert that there should be national languages, for example. Typically assumes in its models and empirical analysis that the nation state is the container of relative processes. Well, it's that way because it's the pragmatics of the situation. Doesn't mean that you can't change that. He also seems committed to reproducing the standard disciplinary inside-outside dichotomy of economics, endogenous, exogenous. These tenets are closely linked to his de facto reliance on closed systems methodology, at least for the large part of the analysis. Although Sheikh's book is a useful handbook covering an ambitious variety of topics, most of which I have not been able to consider in this review, my overall conclusion is nonetheless that capitalism does not provide a new foundation for economic theory. That was not necessarily his goal. That would require problematizing and reconstructing the methodology and ontology of political economy at a deeper level. Well, yeah, that'd be kind of a different book because, this is just one step. The next step would be from to go beyond Shaik's book, because there is a beyond, I don't think he would complain. Is now how would we deal with the subset, or the kind of interesting development that has still its roots in what Shaik is talking about, and that is democratic socialism, for example. I mean, and you can see the current conflict for a variety of political reasons why that is difficult. So anyway, Shaik remains committed to about half of Bakhsar's 8 characteristics of the discourse of modernity, and I probably will talk about that further. More freedom is needed. Well, yes and no, but I urge that you kind of deal with it in that way. Let's see how much time we have. Yeah, we have a little bit of time, so I'll go along a little further here on the Charlie Post article, Why Capitalism Fails. This is kind of the next thing. This underlying notion that crises occur partially because capitalism has designed in it this kind of dynamic set of relations, ebbs, flows, cycles, etc., peaks and troughs, and et cetera, et cetera. The technical question, which is, I think, what Shaik is, ultimately driving at, is, how are you going to deal with these things? That is, the ebbs and flows, the peaks and valleys that aren't necessarily a business cycle, or that they're much, derived in much different ways, like Piketty's work, that comes from looking at longer waves or periods of how cycles operate. So anyway, the different amplitudes, let's put it that way. Different socialist strategies rest implicitly or explicitly, right, inside, outside, on different crisis theories. This talk will review the 3 main radical and Marxian theories: underconsumption, profit squeeze, and the falling rate of profit. These things happen, and sometimes one person's underconsumption is another person's austerity, and that, et cetera. To determine their theoretical consistency, factual accuracy, and political implications. So all of these things are still at work. This doesn't negate anything that Shaik says. Shaik is just giving a kind of method, or a way in which you can estimate or discover how underconsumption, profit squeeze, and falling rate of profit kind of operate. All right, there's little debate among mainstream radical and Marxian economists that periodic crises mark the history of capitalism. In the US and globally, at least 40 recessions and depressions lasting 6 to 8 years on average have occurred since the early 19th century. Each of these cycles is marked by a 3 to 4 year boom. See, boom and bust, right? Ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys in investment and production, followed by a contraction in output and investment and a wave of business bankruptcies. In addition to these cycles, there have been at least 4 long periods of accumulation. Now, you can argue a little bit about when one starts and when ends and blah, 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 blah. But here you can see these big 4 long periods of accumulation: 1869 to 1914, a turbulent era, but that's Marx's time. 1914 to 1965, you have a couple of world wars, Keynes, but a bunch of stuff there, right? 1965 to 1983, you can see stuff happening within that context, shocks and other kinds of crazy stuff. And 1982 to 2008. Needless to say, we're in another kind of weird accumulation period that probably has not seen its full explication. But you can see that a world rate of profit can be derived, and it kind of looks like this. And you can see, there's a long depression from 69 to 1899. There's a whole bunch of panics and other stupid stuff that happens in here. A recovery that occurs at the turn of the century. And this occurs for a variety of reasons that include the rise of trust, the increase of social welfare, certain institutional changes. This is pre-World War II, World War I, I'm sorry, the Great War. and then you have the war, and then you have recovery, and then, crazy stuff happens, right? Great Depression, right? This dip right here in the 30s, 1930s, and then, of course, another war, World War II, and then this so-called golden age. It's the golden age of capital for some people. And in fact, it is um, a trope manifested by the current administration that suggests that's kind of where we need to get back to. um, the world before civil rights, or uh, the world ending Jim Crow, a variety of other things. And yes, there's a profitability crisis that comes at that sort of moment, and it comes because of among many things, certain financial crises that are affected by, fossil fuels and a bunch of other things, and of course, awareness of other crazy stuff. And then there is, right around in the 80s, in the Reagan era, a neoliberal recovery, extended, of course, by various, um, in the US, by certain administrations, but because of global hegemony, they have a great influence. And so neoliberalism is pretty ubiquitous. And then, of course, a new crisis/depression that occurs in this little period. And we've discussed this in terms of the great financial crisis, the recession, et cetera, 2007, 2008, and sort of the next era of the rate of profit. Where is it going to go? Is it going to go down or up? Or, because you can see this kind of downward progression here that some people might suggest is a falling rate of profit. Each of these long accumulative waves was marked by 20 to 25 years of contractions where recessions were deep and recoveries weak, because that's why it heads downward, and 20 to 25 years of expansion where recessions were weak and recoveries strong. There's a general consensus that the capitalist world economy, and this is the capitalist world economy from 1869 to now, entered a new long period of stagnation and contraction around 2007 to 2008. There is stagnation and contraction. It's mentioned nearly every day. We can see various elements of it, some of which are being caused by, certain desires or bad policies or reactionary craziness. And that's where we are. However, there's little agreement about the causes and consequences of this recurring economic turbulence. Remember, Sheikh talks about turbulence, and that's a kind of commonality that is part of capitalism in that particular context. Mainstream economists insist that the market economy, their euphemism for capitalism, should produce smooth and steady growth. Well, smooth and steady growth certainly clearly isn't there if you just look at the data. Recessions and long-term crises are the result of unexpected and unpredictable shocks to the economy, such that, some people would say that it's doctrinal in that sense, to quote certain other folks. Radical and Marxian economists, on the other hand, argue that economic downturns are a necessary feature of capitalism. Now, some people would like to throw up their hands and say they're unexpected and unpredictable. Well, not really, because these same people believe in business cycles and stuff. So it's a necessary feature despite what we say. So, and we're now back to Anwar Sheikh, right? As Anwar Sheikh argues, crises are an absolute normal phase of a long-standing recurrent pattern of capitalist accumulation in which long booms eventually give way to long downturns or busts. Now, although radical and Marxian economists agree that capitalism is subject to periodic crises, there's no consensus on what causes crises. Now, if you go back to Marx, this is an issue, and he was there during a time where you think, well, gosh, everything is going to hell, at least in the nations that are around where I live, and so therefore, maybe this will happen in a global way, but that didn't quite do that. Today, most radical economists claim that the root of capitalist crisis is not located in the production process, but in the absence of effective demand. Now, this is different, right? This is, instead of looking at the production side, you're kind of thinking about the circulation problems. They are the crises of underconsumption. That is, in the 70s and 80s, most critical economists saw crises rooted in the struggle between capital and labor over wages and profits. These profit squeeze theorists argued that some combination of wage increases or workers' successful resistance to speed up and de-skilling, this is post-Fordist stuff, led to declining labor productivity in the 1960s, reducing profits and sparking the global crisis of that era. And yes, transformations do occur. And if you wanted to go back to the kind of causality of this, is, you can blame this on the post-World War II capitalist culture. You could even drill down and say, well, you can blame it on people like Deming and just in time, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of the front end of the crises. But anyway, the defenders of Marxist theory of the falling rate of profit argue that the crises are a necessary result of the competitively driven process of capitalist accumulation. In fact, there's considerable historical evidence for this. Now, how regular it is the macrodynamic problem, and which is solved, or not solved, but made clearer by things that Shake and Steve Keen, et cetera, are looking at, and that is the structural dynamics of economies. Now, for many on the left, these debates appear to be abstract academic disputes with little relevance to political practice. Well, now, in reality, different socialist strategies rest implicitly or explicitly on different crisis theories, and there's a whole literature for this. This talk will review the three main radical and Marxian theories: underconsumption, profit squeeze, and the falling rate of profit, to determine their theoretical consistency, factual accuracy, and political implications. Now, you can't solve all that in one thing, but you can sort of point towards these are pretty major issues: underconsumption rather than overproduction, profit squeeze as opposed to other kinds of squeezes, and of course, this question of the falling rate of profit. I'm going to have to end in a couple of minutes, but I think you can sort of see where this is going. However, while there's no one-to-one correspondence between a crisis theory and a political strategy, underconsumption and profit squeeze arguments are generally associated with reformist social democratic politics. However, revolutionaries have also embraced these theories. So, you can see, well, doom is coming, whatever, and maybe a revolution is going to, can come from this. Well, that you can see how that has failed at various moments. We will focus on how each theory crisis defines not merely causes, but a range of possible resolutions of the crisis, which then defines the concrete program a radical left should fight for and the social forces we rely on. You can see that in the eco-socialist discourse, this is exactly the problem. Exactly what motivates us to go out and say, well, we're going to run out of nature. Underconsumption. Before the 1970s, again, since the 2007-2008 recession, the dominant crisis theory on the U.S. and global left is one or another variant of underconsumption. Economists associated with the United States Communist Party, the Monthly Review School of Brian Sweezy and John Bellamy Foster, yes. The AFL-CIO aligned economic, the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, the Democratic Party liberal Paul Krugman, and the postmodern Marxist Richard Wolff all argue, two Fs, all argue that recurrent economic crises are the result of capitalism's lack of any internal mechanism to generate demand sufficient to buy back a growing supply of goods and services. In its simplest form, the fact that workers are paid a wage that is less than the value of what they produce is said to give rise to a gap between demand and supply. It does divide, all kinds of people on the left, these questions. Underconsumption theories, like the profit squeeze arguments, because they're kind of connected, appeal to many on the anti-capitalist left because they make the relationship of class forces the root cause of capitalist crisis, and Shake has talked about that as well. As capitalists pursue the greatest profits by restraining wages, and yes, we're in a phase where that's happened, they actually destroy the markets for their output, leading to crises. It's kind of where we're going now, where, for example, monkey business is occurring in the copper market with tariffs, and Not that we really know where that's going to go. It's just symptomatic of a certain kind of naivete about how the economies operate. But it doesn't stop people from saying, well, we're going to put 50% tariff for X number of reasons, which aren't really the reasons, but, it's a way of capitalizing, as it were, on that kind of crisis. The revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg argued that the inability of capitalists to sell their goods at home compels them to seek external markets abroad for their excess supply. This comes from Lenin. She concluded that once the entire world became capitalist, the inability to find markets for goods and services would lead to the collapse of capitalism. Now, that's one of the implications, that Lenin also looks at. It's a accumulation crisis. Nevertheless, underconsumption theories of crisis are usually mobilized to support the creation of a quote-unquote regulated capitalism. Many proponents of the theory argue that the golden age of capitalism from 1940 to 1975 overcame the problem of insufficient demand through capitalist state policies that redistributed income to workers and provided incentives for capitalist investment. Well, yes and no. Today, they argue that a coalition of union officials, social movement leaders, and progressive politicians, like those who lead European social democratic parties or the U.S. Democratic Party, can secure a new win-win solution to the crisis that would raise living standards for workers and increase profitability for capitalists. This is kind of neoliberal sort of thing, centrist. Put simply, underconsumption theories generally support the reformist claim that capitalist crises can be avoided if the state, as a quote-unquote neutral arbiter, can successfully balance the interests of capital and labor, balancing supply and demand. Underconsumption theories rest on a fundamentally false assumption about capitalism, that capitalists produce only consumer goods, and the only market for consumer goods are the workers who produce them. In reality, however, capitalists produce both consumer and capital goods, that is, machinery, buildings, raw materials, and the like. Workers employed in an expanded consumer and capital goods sector can earn enough to buy the output of the consumer goods sector, while capitalists in both the consumer and capital goods sector can spend enough to buy the output of the capital goods sector. As long as capitalists in both capital and consumer goods sectors are investing, supply and demand can be turbulently regulated, leading to short-term business cycles rather than long periods of growth and stagnation. Continued investment, that is, capital accumulation, ultimately depends upon rising profits. When profits fall, investment slacks, employment drops, and demand for both consumer and capital goods drops, leading to overproduction. Put simply, underconsumption is the result, not the cause, of falling profits. So this is a causal argument that was bought into at a certain moment when the economy was perhaps more underdeveloped in that sense. The political implications of the theory of the falling rate of profit are profound. Capitalist state policies under any government, whether of the left or right, cannot engineer a win-win solution to the crisis that simultaneously maintains employment, wages, and working conditions, and the conditions for profitable and competitive accumulation. There's considerable empirical evidence to challenge the notion that insufficient demand causes crises. Most economists recall that, this is what people said at the end of COVID, right? 5 years ago, go out and, you got to start consuming. Most economists recognize that capitalist firms adjust to fluctuations in demand by adjusting capacity utilization, that is, increasing or reducing the number of workers through the addition or elimination of work shifts. Sheikh has developed a statistical method to adjust profit rate data for capacity utilization. He found that profits, even when adjusted for capacity utilization, that is, fluctuations in demand, still fall periodically. This is why Sheikh is important, is to study why is this happening, and not to just sort of assume that certain other perhaps fictions about how the economy operates or how capital operates. Michael Roberts has examined the relationship between fluctuations in consumption, investment, and total output in 6 cyclical downturns since the 1950s. In each, the primary driver of the decline in output is not changes in consumption, but sharp drops in profit-driven investment. And you can see this probably more obviously in the 2007-2008. But anyway, in fact, during the 1980-82 recession, consumption grew around 1%, while investment dropped over 10%, leading to a nearly 1% drop in output. Now, profit squeeze. So, you looked at the underconsumption problem, and that has all these other dynamic elements in it. Now, look at profit squeeze. During the last long crisis of profitability of the late 1960s and 70s, the profit squeeze became the dominant left-wing explanation of the decline of profitability and accumulation across the capitalist world. Today, few claim that the increased strength of workers who suffered nearly continuous defeats since the early 1980s has caused the current crisis. However, in the late 1960s and 70s, a number of radical economists argued that the increasing strength of workers, the result of wildcat strikes and other workplace struggles, caused a sharp and general fall in profits in all of the industrial capitalist societies. Two revolutionary socialists, Andrew Glenn and Bob Sutcliffe, were the first to argue that the rising workers' wages in the late 1960s led to a decline in capitalist profitability in the early 1970s. By the 1980s, three left social democrats, that is Sam Bowles, David Gordon, and Tom Weisskopf, took up this argument, claiming that the ability of workers to raise wages, win broad social reforms that partially decommodified labor power and blocked corporate attempts to reorganize the labor process was the primary cause of the crisis. Worker struggles led to a declining rate of growth of labor productivity, rising costs of maintaining capitalist control over workers and production, and a rising social wage, that is, social welfare payments, all of which squeezed corporate profits. And you can see the reaction to that in the current state, right? Get rid of people's benefits, kill all benefit packages, or recommodify, let's say, healthcare, for example. Like underconsumption theories, profit squeeze theories appealed to many anti-capitalists and socialists because they made class power, in this case, the strength of labor, the key determinant of profitability. However, making class struggle the central determinant of profitability actually led to a politics of class collaboration. This is the PMC critique, right? Gordon, Bowles, and Weisskopf were important proponents of workplace co-management and labor management cooperation. They claimed that these experiments in workplace democracy would raise productivity, allowing both capitalist profits and workers' living and working conditions to improve simultaneously. Many advocates of this solution to the crisis argued that workplace democracy could be won by an alliance of labor officials and liberal Democrats. As Jane Slaughter, Mike Parker, Kim Moody, and others have demonstrated, such experiments in labor management cooperation have been, at best, a cover for the introduction and spread of lean production. This is, flexible production, weakening unions and fragmenting and, offshoring, et cetera, and intensifying work across the capitalist economy, so the non-national capitalist economy. Logically and theoretically, rising wages or declining worker efforts can only reduce profits for short periods of time, and only in certain branches of production. Capitalists in a particular industry can respond to rising wages or declining worker effort through either the introduction of new and more productive machinery, or, if it's not immediately possible, by diverting new investment into industries where wages are lower, worker effort more intense, and profits higher. Flexible production, right? Put simply, neither rising wages nor declining worker effort can lead to a general and prolonged crisis of profitability like that of the 1960s and 70s. Data also challenges the profit squeeze argument. The rate of growth of productivity began to fall in the mid-1960s, well before the upsurge of worker militancy as a result of falling capital investment. The fall in capital investment was a response to falling profit. Put simply, the slowdown of productivity growth was an effect, like what we were talking about before, not the cause of the onset of the crisis in the mid-1960s. And of course, there were other issues that were cultural issues. Now, finally, the falling rate of profit. Marx put forward the theory of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the TRPF, in the third volume of Capital. And recall that the third volume of Capital is sort of incomplete in that sense, which was first published in 1894. 11 years after Marx dies. However, most Marxists in the Second and Third International, these are, communist socialist internationals, ignored the theory until 1929 when Henrik Grossman published his groundbreaking Law of Accumulation, the Law of Accumulation. And this idea about accumulation is important because we have a feature of it represented in the discourse of Rosa Luxemburg, but also within the context of current sort of new interpretation arguments. Anwar Shaikh and Michael Roberts are among its best-known advocates. The theory roots crises in the same mechanisms that produce capitalism's dynamism. That is, and this is why looking at Shaikh's work is important, accumulation and competition. Note that Shaikh began his discussion of the course with not making competition controversial. Unlike the trope that is manifested by some capitalists that, oh, well, you don't need socialism because it's going to, or we're against socialism because of declining productivity and anti-competitive nature, blah blah blah. Not so. Accumulation and competition will still occur under socialism. Ultimately, the point is to get even further beyond that. But in the short run, one shouldn't worry so much about that. You should worry about analyzing it clearly, but it's a feature, not a bug. For capitalists, real competition compels them to constantly reduce cost per unit output in relation to other capitalists. Capitalists, in order to survive the competitive war of all against all, not only have to reduce wage costs, but also must constantly reorganize work to increase labor productivity. It's the rate of exploitation that's just been there since, the 19th century. Capitalists increase exploitation through both the fragmentation and routinization of tasks, and crucially through the mechanization of the production process. This is the same argument that has been there all along for the last, century and a half. Capitalism necessarily leads to debilitating, alienating work, constant pressure to cut wages and speed up the pace of work, and the replacement of workers with machines. Now, at the center of Marx's theory of crisis is the increasing capitalization of production or rising organic composition of capital. This is a traditional, it's a conventional model. Rate of profit equals R equals S over C plus V. R equals S over V divided by C over V plus 1. The rate of profit can be expressed as a simple fraction. The numerator of the fraction is the total amount of unpaid labor, that is surplus value S, pumped out of working people. The fraction's denominator is the capitalist investment costs in building machines and raw materials. Constant capital, big C. It's not, copyright symbol, it's bracket, big C, bracket. And wages, variable, wages dash variable capital V, small v, small C. We also can view the rate of profit as the relationship between the amount of surplus value produced compared to wages, that is the rate of exploitation, S over V, and the relationship between constant capital and variable capital, the organic composition of capital, small c over small v. This formula allows us to grasp the relationship between the rate of exploitation and the organic composition of capital. The higher the rate of exploitation and the lower the organic composition of capital, the higher the rate of profit. The lower the rate of exploitation and the higher the organic composition of capital, the lower the rate of profit. Now, you can see that the implication here is, of course, because variable capital signifies something like labor, that this, you can see it sort of attached to labor conflict when in fact it's a little more integrated than that. When the organic composition of capital rises more quickly than the rate of exploitation, the rate of profit will fall. If the rate of exploitation rises more quickly than the organic composition of capital as a result of, for example, 2008, 2007 to 8, the result of massive bankruptcies that destroy inefficient constant capital combined with increasing work intensity and lowering of wages, the rate of profit will rise. This is kind of what happened when toxic, whatever, assets were fixed. Put simply, capitalist accumulation and competition produce both the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and its counter tendency, both crises and recovery. So you have both things operating at the same time. It's not one thing and then maybe another thing. actually these things are happening all simultaneously. And this is the structural dynamics question that uh, uh, um, uh, Mockover et al. And Keene are kind of talking about. Both Roberts and Shake have constructed measures of the rate of profit. Shake plots the movements of the rate of profit of enterprise for U.S. non-financial corporations from 1947 to 2007. And so what you see here is a way in which you can talk about this kind of rate of profit of enterprise, non-financial corporations, and you can see the stagflation crisis dropping things in the 60s to the early 80s. And then after that, a kind of rebound. And then, of course, the current crisis. So this is a very long swing in that particular context. The general rate of profit is the measured gross of monetary profit minus interest paid, dividend paid, divided by the capital stock. The rate of profit of enterprise is the general rate of profit minus the rate of interest. According to Shake, the rate of profit of enterprise is the central drive of accumulation, the material foundation of the quote-unquote animal spirits of industrial capital. It is the average rate of profit that capitalists earn from productive investment rather than investing in financial instruments. This is a kind of important and a conflict in the literature. We can see three distinctive phases of the movement in profitability since the Second World War. First phase, 47 to 66, was the post-war boom, which saw a relatively stable rate of profit or enterprise. Second phase, 66 to 82, was the stagflation crisis with a sharp decline in the rate of profit of enterprise, falling from 14% to minus 5% in 1982. The third was the neoliberal boom of 1982 to 2007, characterized by a sharp increase in the rate of profit of enterprise from a low of the minus 5% to 10% in 2005. Now, that may not seem a lot, but it is. And then where we are now is in this neoliberal boom, sort of. Three factors ended the stagflation crisis and sustained the neoliberal boom. The first were two waves of bankruptcy, initial destruction of less efficient and less profitable firms during the recession of 1980 to 82, the Reagan era, followed by waves of corporate reorganization and mergers and acquisitions over the next decade, which shuttered older, less competitive and profitable operations. These bankruptcies and corporate reorganization reduced the value of the capital stock. That is, it devalorized constant capital and reduced the organic composition of capital, the denominator for the rate of profit. Note, of course, that this is the same period in which we have, various revolutions, information revolution, computers, microcomputers, blah, 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 blah. The scale of the devalorization of constant capital in the 1980s paled in comparison to that of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Not surprisingly, the neoliberal boom was not anywhere near as vibrant as the post-war expansion, for hopefully obvious reasons. And also because, it was a pretty debilitating war. Instead, the wave of bankruptcies in the 1980s were on a similar scale to those during the long depression of the 1870s and 1880s, which produced the less dynamic long expansion of 1894 to 1914. And it was less dynamic, and there were considerable numbers of panics and other kinds of things that happened during the period. The second factor was the exceedingly low interest rates in the U.S. and globally after about 1983 that sustained the rate of profit on enterprise until 2008. Now, this is the result of lots of different macro factors and always makes a difficult, problematic kind of conversation because some people just, don't want to accept certain things. Anyway, I've gone on too long, and I urge you to look at this because it addresses pretty much where we are now. Let's look at the end. The political implications of the theory of the falling rate of profit are profound. Capitalist state policies under any government, whether that of the left or right, cannot engineer a win-win solution to the crisis that simultaneously maintains employment, wages, and working conditions, and the conditions for profitable and competitive accumulation. Socialists engaged in any and all struggles that challenge capital, whether for better wages and working conditions, to expand social spending, and to build a mass challenge to the rising tide of tax on people of color, immigrants, women, and queer folks, need to understand that there are no win-win solutions to these struggles. And you can see certainly in the current administration, it's all about, zero, zero sum stuff. You know, one can win only if other people lose. Only independent mass and militant movements of working people capable and willing to engage in massive social disruption, in particular disruptions of production, will be able to stop the renewed capitalist offensive. The inability of the forces of official reformism, that is, labor officials, middle-class leaders of women, queers, and people of color, liberal politicians, to organize these sorts of struggles is what has led them to abandon the struggle for reform. As we've seen time and time again, we cannot rely on these forces to organize a struggle to defend the existing gains of working and oppressed people, no less traverse the only road out of the long roller coaster of capitalist expansion and crisis, the revolutionary abolition of capitalism. Only a self-organized and militant working class movement will be capable of defending past gains and ultimately replacing the current social order with a democratic and collectivist society dash socialism, also known as socialism. So anyway, I got to the end of that. Tomorrow, we're going to look at a new lecture series. Not so much, this was part 9. We're going to start with a new number 1, which is it will review after considerable time what Sheikh was looking at, and we'll see whether we can get through the first couple of lectures. This is after the 2016 book was published, so I think you'll see some refinements of the way in which he was doing his lectures, and I hope you'll find that useful. We'll do that for a couple of times. On the weekend, we'll be reading Marx again, partially in preparation for hopefully the Andy Ingenbottom presentation of on the third volume 3 of Marx's Capital, which is coming in the fall. So I hope you'll stick around for all of those little things. I note, of course, there's a couple of really good things that you might look at. Roberts' The Long Depression, Marxism, and the Global Crisis of Capitalism. Certainly, Michael Roberts, he cranks out stuff every day, does some really good work, interesting stuff. And then, of course, Anwar Sheikh, this piece began with the kind of the problem of crisis theories, because that's a standard in the radical literature that you need to sort of come to grips with, because we hope that there will be a defining crisis, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So anyway, I'm going to stop right now. See if there was a question they needed to answer. Oh, good. Thank you for the quality. I'm going to end the, come on, I'm going to end the live stream and then